Hi everyone. This is the second part of the review for Chapter 13 that's going to focus on Martin Van Buren's presidency and going to Texas. New parties were created in 1828. So in 1828, the Democratic Republicans adopted the name Democrats, and the Whigs were created by Jackson's opponents. They hated Jackson and his executive usurpation. They felt he was misusing his presidential power. These people first emerged in the Senate, where Clay and Webster and Calhoun joined forces in 1834 to pass a motion that censured Jackson for his single-handed removal of the federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. Others who joined the Whigs were supporters of Clay's American system, Southern states' writers, Northern industrialists, merchants, and many evangelical Protestants. The Whigs saw themselves as conservative but were progressive in support of government programs and reforms, such as internal improvements and support for institutions like prisons, asylums, and public schools. Other issues for Whigs were they welcomed the market economy. By absorbing the anti-Masonic Party, they blunted the democratic appeal to the common man. And the Whigs claimed to defend the common man and declared that the Democrats were the party of cronyism and corruption. So Martin Van Buren of New York is Jackson's choice as successor in 1836. Jackson rigs the convention to nominate Van Buren. The Jacksonites supported Van Buren, but weren't very enthusiastic about it, and the Whigs were unable to nominate a single candidate. So the Whig strategy was to run several favorite sons, each with a different regional appeal, hoping to scatter the vote so that no one candidate would win the majority. So then the deadlock would have to be decided by the U.S. House, where the Whigs would have a chance. So the Whigs' favorite son was General William Henry Harrison of Ohio, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Whig scheme failed. Van Buren gained office by winning the popular vote. He won by a comfortable margin of the electoral votes from 170 to 124 for all the Whigs combined in the Electoral College. Van Buren becomes the 8th president, the first one born under the American flag. The statesman had wide experience in legislative and administrative life. In intelligence, education, and training, he was above average for presidents since Jefferson. He labored under severe handicaps, though. As a machine-made candidate, he incurred the resentment of many Democrats, and he inherited Jackson's numerous and vengeful enemies. His 4 years overflowed with toil and trouble. He had 2 short-lived rebellions in Canada to deal with in 1837 that caused incidents along the northern frontier and threatened war. Anti-slavery agitators condemned the possible annexation of Texas, and Jackson bequeathed to Van Buren a searing economic depression as a result of the veto of the National Bank. The Panic of 1837 was caused by rampant speculation from mania of getting rich quickism. The speculative craze spread from the western lands and the wildcat banks to canals, roads, railroads, and slaves. Jackson's actions, including the bank war and the specie circular, gave it an additional jolt, and the failure of the wheat crops actually deepened the distress. These financial problems abroad would also hurt Americans' economy when the 2 British banks failed as well. The hardship was acute and widespread. Hundreds of American banks collapsed. Commodity prices drooped, sales of all public lands fell off, and customs revenues dried up. Factories closed, and unemployment in workers increased. This is a picture of a painting about the long bill and about Americans basically who were confronted with bills that they could not pay as a result of the Panic of 1837. So this is going to be an economic depression, and the Whigs are going to propose some active government remedies. They're going to expand the bank credit, higher tariffs, and subsidies for internal improvements. Van Buren is going to spurn these ideas, and he is going to come up with Van Buren's divorce bill, which would separate government from the banks altogether. And by establishing a so-called independent treasury, the government would lock its surplus money into vaults. Van Buren's divorce scheme was never popular. Fellow Democrats gave lukewarm support, and the Whigs condemned it because it squelched hopes for the revived Bank of the United States. After a prolonged struggle, the Independent Treasury Bill was passed in 1840. It was repealed in 1841 by the Whigs, a scheme reenacted by the Democrats in 1846. And this continued until Republicans instituted a network of national banks during the Civil War. So next we're going to focus on going to Texas. And in 1821, the Mexicans won independence from Spain. The new regime concluded an 1823 agreement that granted a huge tract of land to an American named Stephen Austin. He promised that he would bring 300 American families to Texas and that they would all convert to Catholicism. The settlers would also be properly Mexicanized, which means that they would speak the language, and the other stipulation was that they were not allowed to bring slaves. So these two stipulations were largely ignored. Texas Americans numbered about 30,000 by 1835. They were the most law-abiding, but some left states just ahead of the sheriff. So GTT, gone to Texas, became a descriptive slang during this time period. Among the settlers was Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. Jim Bowie created the Bowie knife. A latecomer was ex-governor of Tennessee, Sam Houston, who we'll talk about soon enough. These pioneer individualists who came to Texas were not easy to push around. The friction increased between the Mexicans and the Texans over the issue of slavery, immigration, and local rights. Slavery was a particular touchy topic. Mexico had freed its slaves in 1830 and banned further importation of slaves into Texas, as well as further colonization by the troublesome Americans, but Texans refused to honor these decrees. They kept their slaves, and new settlers kept coming, bringing more and more slaves into Texas. Stephen Austin went to Mexico City in 1833 to negotiate the differences. The dictator, Santa Anna, jailed him for 8 months. And an explosion came in 1835 when Santa Anna not only wiped out the local rights of the Texans, but he started to raise an army to suppress the Texans and to make them follow the rules. This is a picture of Sam Houston, who will eventually be elected as the president of Texas. This will lead to the Lone Star Rebellion. In 1836, Texas declared its independence, and they named Sam Houston as their commander-in-chief. Santa Anna, the Mexican dictator, with 6,000 men, swept into Texas. He trapped 200 Texans in the Alamo in San Antonio and wiped them out after 13 days. A band of 400 Texans were defeated at Goliad following that, and then butchered as pirates. This is a mosaic that's done in 1959 by Burt Reeds of Austin, Texas, and showing one of the defenders' cannons from the Alamo, as well as their legendary battle flag of defiance, which actually did say, "Come and take it." The Battle of the Alamo is pictured here in this interpretation. All of these operations delayed the Mexican advance and galvanized American opposition. The slain heroes, Bowie and Crockett, became legendary in death. The Texan war cries were "Remember the Alamo" and "Remember Goliad," or "Death to Santa Anna." And scores of vengeful Americans seized rifles and rushed to the aid of relatives, friends, and compatriots. Sam Houston's small army retreated to the east. They lured Santa Anna to San Jacinto, near the site of the city that bears Houston's name in present time. 1,300 Mexicans versus 900 Texans were at this battle, and on April 21st, 1836, Sam Houston, taking advantage of a Mexican siesta, wiped out the Mexican force and captured Santa Anna. Facing 30 Bowie knives, Santa Anna was forced to sign 2 treaties. This is a map of all of the battles of the Texas Revolution, and you can pause and review them. Santa Anna agreed to withdraw Mexican troops, recognized the Rio Grande as the southwestern boundary of Texas, and after his release, Santa Anna, though, repudiated these treaties because he had been extorted and forced to sign them. This is a picture of the West Side main plaza in San Antonio, Texas. So this basically kind of demonstrates that even though Texas becomes part of the United States, it retains a strong Spanish-Mexican flavor, especially in the architecture and the activities that people participate in there. Americans overwhelmingly favored Texans, even though in 1819 the United States recognized Spanish control of Texas in exchange for Florida. In 1837, the departing President Jackson extended recognition to the Lone Star Republic. Many Texans wanted recognition of independence and outright union with the United States. Texas petitions for annexation into the United States in 1837. The United States hesitated because of the slavery issue. Most settlers that went to Texas were from the South and the Southwest. So the explanation was proximity, not conspiracy. Many Texans were slaveholders, and admitting Texas to the Union as a slave state meant greatly enlarging American slavery. The Democrats nominated in the election of 1840 Van Buren, and the Whigs nominated only one candidate this time, Ohio's William Henry Harrison, who was believed to be the one who could get the most votes. The Whigs published no official platform, and as a result of a Democratic editor's insult, they adopted something called the hard cider and log cabin as symbols of their campaign. Basically, this is, again, another explanation or example of how Texas retained a strong Spanish-Mexican flavor. Back to the election of 1840. The Whig campaign was a masterpiece. Harrison was from one of the FFVs, which is the First Families of Virginia. So Harrison, through his log cabin and hard cider campaign, will win by a surprisingly close margin of popular votes, but an overwhelming electoral majority. The Whigs sought to expand and stimulate the economy, and the Democrats favored retrenchment and an end to the high-flying banks and aggressive corporations. This is a political cartoon titled Martin Van Buren Gags on Hard Cider. This goes along with the election of 1840. So this is a pull card that shows Van Buren on the left sipping champagne. When the right-hand card was pulled out, Van Buren's face sours as he discovered that his champagne was actually hard cider. This cartoonist is clearly sympathizing with Van Buren's opponent in the 1840 election, William Henry Harrison, who waged the famous log cabin and hard cider campaign. So, the 1840 election demonstrated two major changes in politics since the era of good feelings. First, the triumph of the populist democratic style. By 1840, the aristocracy was tainted and democracy was respectable. Politicians were first forced to curry favor with the voting masses, and the wealthy and prominent had to forsake social pretensions and cultivate the common touch if they hoped to win elections. So basically, politicians now had to present their side or their campaign to the people. The common man was moving to the center of the national political stage, and America was now bowing to the divine right of the people. This is a picture called the county election. This basically demonstrates and kind of satirizes the drinking and wheeling and dealing that sometimes marred the electoral process and bolstered the age of Jacksonian politics. So, the second dramatic change was the formation of the vigorous two-party system. Jeffersonians were so successful in absorbing the Federalist programs that the true two-party system never emerged. The idea still prevailed that parties equal conspiracy and faction and injured the health of the virtuous republic. Both parties grew out of Jeffersonian republicanism. Each laid claim to different aspects of inheritance. The Democrats glorified the liberty of the individual and guarded against inroads of privilege into the government, while the Whigs triumphed the natural harmony of society and were willing to use government to realize objectives. They berated leaders who appealed to self-interest. The Democrats clung to the states' rights and the federal restraint in social and economic affairs, while the Whigs favored the renewed national bank, protective tariffs, internal improvements, public schools, and moral reforms like prohibition and an end to slavery. They were separated by real differences in philosophy and policy, but they also had much in common. They were mass-based catch-all parties that were mobilized as many voters as possible, and they socially and geographically had diversity within each and encouraged compromise and avoided the creation of sectional parties. This is the chronology from the chapter. Thanks for listening.